welcome to this video on the first lesson of our reproduction scheme. This lesson is really about introducing the core concept that runs throughout this scheme of work, whether it's for human reproduction or for plant reproduction. And that's this idea of fertilization, the idea that when we've got sexual reproduction, something is coming from one organism that is somehow joining to this other thing from another organism. I'm talking about the sperm and the egg, of course, and those two kind of fuse together to produce a completely new organism. And again, this is a concept that we kind of take for granted because it's so it's almost become intuitive to us now. But what we've got to remember is how children might make sense of what's going on, and there could be all sorts of ways, because they probably, by the time they get to secondary school and they're learning about this in year 7, they've probably had the birds and the bees talk, and they know that, you know, when a man and a woman have sex, then somehow a baby is created. But what happens in that interim period between that moment of having sex and 9 months later when a baby appears is a bit of a mystery. And it's funny, it's one of those topics where when my wife and I had a son, it still feels like a bit of a mystery. How is it that this thing can appear without anyone really having to put in any conscious effort whatsoever during that 9-month period? So really the purpose of this scheme of work is to give students a model of what's going on inside the body that allows this new organism to be created. And a nice, what I hope is a nice way of introducing this is to compare our modern theory of fertilization to an older theory. Various people held this theory. I'm just going to ascribe it to one person, Van Leeuwenhoek, because he's quite famous anyway for discovering the microscope and so on. But really what this is about, there's this big debate in science between the people who were called the preformationists, who thought that the baby was kind of fully formed in the sperm cell or sometimes in the mother, and then all it had to do was kind of just grow like that. That was one view. There was also this other view, epigenesis, people who thought that undifferentiated material somehow developed into differentiated material, and organs grew, and tissues and other body parts and so on. And that's the view that now prevails. But what we want to give students a sense of is that, there are different ways of understanding what's going on, and the modern way is the best way of understanding it. And I'm also going to bring in an idea of inheritance in this lesson, which links into something that we're doing later, and is really fundamental to understanding this whole topic. So I'll start with Van Leeuwenhoek. Not an easy name to spell. I had to practice it a lot yesterday when I was planning this lesson. So Van Leeuwenhoek. So he had this idea that, okay, well, we know that reproduction happens when a man and a woman have sex. And again, in this lesson, I've said something about sexual reproduction. So this is my woman. These are not very good diagrams, but it doesn't matter too much. We're talking about sexual reproduction. And we're not going to go into asexual reproduction in this unit. We're really just focusing on the sexual reproduction. Oops. But it's worth students knowing, the students are going to need to know that there are two organisms involved. So we've got the man and the woman, let's say. And what Van Leeuwenhoek thought was, well, he had a microscope, and he was the first person to discover that inside the male, these are produced in the testes, you have these very tiny cells called sperms. So he saw that there were these little tiny cells called sperms. Now what he did, or what he assumed I should say, he assumed that inside each one of these sperms, he was what's called a spermist, a very nicely titled name for a scientific school of thought. He was a spermist apparently. What he thought was inside each sperm, there was a miniature human being, literally like a tiny preformed baby, tiny preformed version of a human being like this, ready to grow. Now he thought that what happened was during sex, this sperm, this tiny miniature human being, was implanted into the woman's body, and then over the course of this 9-month period, if I come down here like this, over the course of 9 months, what was produced was a baby. Now, the reasons for this are a little bit beyond year 7. The reasons why he kind of thought this, it's all to do with kind of theories of materialism and, well, okay, how is it that if matter, if everything is just matter moving around, how could it be that undifferentiated cells could kind of change their form? They didn't know about DNA and all that stuff at that time. But I think one of the implications, if we take this in a crude sense, and again, historically, I'm not necessarily being faithful to what actually happened. I'm probably doing Van Leeuwenhoek a disservice, but for the sake of illustrating the concept, I think it's worth saying. If we take this theory literally, that inside the sperm there's this preformed version, it's also worth bearing in mind this was a very kind of patriarchal way of viewing reproduction, but that's another story. But if we take this literally, well, what we'd assume is that the baby, when it grows up to become an adult, is just going to be really a clone of the father, and yet completely different to the mother, because all the material seems to have come from the father. My diagram isn't very good, but what we want to illustrate here is effectively that these two are identical. And this is a problem, because if we follow our guess-deduced check model, so this is up here, this is Van Leeuwenhoek's guess, this is what we would deduce if this theory was true. Well, you'd expect, because everything came from the father, it was inside the sperm already, you should just get an exact copy of the father. When we check that, is that what actually happens? And you can question students about this. Well, of course, it's not. So we need a new guess. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to go like this, and we come to the modern theory. So I want to contrast this old way of thinking about it with the modern way. Now this is really just a way of introducing this. If you don't think the compare and contrast is useful, it's not necessary perhaps to include this, but I think it's a nice way of introducing it to see that our ideas around science and in this case around reproduction have not always been the same, and actually people have held different views, and that's part of what science is all about, is having those debates. So then we can introduce the modern way of thinking about this. So if I draw my parents here now, doing my not very good diagrams. I do a lot of these diagrams when I teach biology. Gingerbread people, I call them. So if I have the two parents here, our modern view is that it's not just one sex cell that's found in one of the parents. What we can show students here is that actually each of these parents has their own sex cells. And these were, the sperm was discovered by Van Leeuwenhoek in the late 1600s. The egg cell and the act of fertilization was only discovered much later in the 1800s. But what we can show students is that the father has all of these different sperm cells, like this, and they may well have seen some of these. We're going to study them in more detail later on. The mother has just one egg cell, or certainly one at a time. That's a very large cell, so this is an egg cell. We call it the ovum. These are sperm cells. Really, I think the key concept, and this is for human reproduction, it's also for plant reproduction, any other animal reproduction as well, sexual reproduction this is. The key concept is that when these two organisms have sex, in this case, with plants obviously there's lots of different ways this can happen, but for human beings they need to have sex. When they have sex, what happens is we get something new happen. So the first stage of this is that actually these two things join, and what we get is something new. And what we're going to tell students in this first lesson, because we want to give them an overview of everything that's happening before we zoom in on different parts of this process, they've got to kind of see the full picture before they can look at the finer details. This first part, this most important part, when these two things join together, that's called fertilization. So that's a really, really crucial step. And this is something that Van Leeuwenhoek and the pre-formationists didn't really appreciate, that something from the man is joining with something from the woman, and this is what's going to help explain inheritance much better later on. Then we have a few more stages, and you can show them. This is the kind of epigenesis. We don't need to use those words, but you can kind of give them a very brief picture. That after fertilization, this new cell starts to form even more new cells, and this process continues. So this develops to this. A bit later, we get this sort of, you can start to see a baby forming. So I'm just going to kind of do something like that. You can start to see the parts of the baby, and then quite a bit later, we actually get a fully formed human being. My human beings don't look very fully formed, but anyway, and that is ready for birth. And we can give students some times here. So this would be after about 3 days. It would look something like this, just a cluster of cells. This would be after about 3 months. We start to, it's recognisably a baby by this point. Well, my diagram's not the best, but hopefully you get the idea. And then after 9 months, the baby's ready to be born. And you can add another thing here, because we want to give them the full picture here, a sense of everything that's going on down here. So this we're going to call gestation, and we'll come back to that in a later lesson, look at it in more detail, but we want to give them a full picture of what's going on here. And at 9 months we get birth, we get a new human being ready to come out into the world. So we're just giving them a picture of everything that's happening in that very mysterious period between having sex and baby being born. And the final thing to say is that when that baby comes out, if this is our deduction, so this is our, if this is our guess, so this is what we think is going on and this is what we think happens in those 9 months. And if we come down here and do our deduction, well, what we'd expect here, sorry to keep moving my camera around, what we'd expect here, because we've got information coming from the man and information coming from the woman, and these two join together to form a new type of cell, what we'd expect is to get some characteristics from the mother and some characteristics from the father. So we can maybe draw mother, father over here. I'll do the father a bit taller. Not always the case, obviously, but I'm generalizing here. And what we can do is show, and this, I mean, there's all sorts of misconceptions, so let's maybe just keep it quite simple. But I'm just going to draw a child like this, and showing that it's not identical to either parent. Again, you might just want to talk this through with students, but what we want to explain to them, and they'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, from themselves or their brothers and sisters or whatever, is that this child is going to have some characteristics from the mother and some characteristics from the father. That's what you'd expect if this fertilization theory was true, and that actually a baby comes from the joining of a cell from the mother and a cell from the father. But is that what actually happens? Yes, it is. So this seems like a much better model than Van Leeuwenhoek's pre-formation model. And that's what the whole of this scheme of work is going to be about, embedding this idea that everything that happens in sexual reproduction happens because of fertilization. That's the one idea that links everything together. So in the next few lessons, we look at the menstrual cycle and this process of the woman producing an egg and making sure that if fertilization happens, she's ready for gestation. Also, if fertilization doesn't happen, what happens next in terms of the egg being passed away and the lining of the uterus breaking down and so on. It all comes back to this idea, and students are going to have to understand this if they understand anything that's going on. We then get contraception, we understand what all the different body parts are about. All of it comes back to this one key idea. And this picture is one I would recommend you keep returning to as you teach each of these lessons. Okay, more videos on this to follow.